Welcome to Talking Kootenai Books. My name is Keith Powell. I'm your host. Today I'm pleased to introduce our guest, Michael Cohen. Michael is from the West Kootenays, and great to have you as a guest, Michael.
Thank you very much, Keith. Thank you for inviting me. I consider this a real honor.
Well, I really appreciate the fact that you've invested so much time and effort into your new book, Connecting the Kootenays. So it's 100 years of service of the Kootenay Lake Ferry. You know, I think everyone in the Kootenays, if they've been in the Kootenays any stretch of time, will recognize the uniqueness of the Kootenay Lake Ferry system. But what you've done is delved into the history and even the modern significance of that ferry system. So I wanted to start out today, Michael, if you could maybe just tell us a little bit about the history of the Kootenay Lake Ferry system.
Okay. Well, most people don't realize it actually dates back to 1921. And that is in connection with the building of the Southern Trans-Provincial Highway. And they were able to reach Kootenay Lake in a relatively easy fashion because they had already built the highway from Cedar to Kuskanak.
Right.
So they used the wharf there. And then the CPR at the time was running a passenger steamer from Nelson to Kootenay Landing, which is at the very south end of Kootenay Lake. And so with that idea in mind, they were able to inaugurate a ferry service, a daily ferry service between Kuskanak and Nelson. And that was the start of the Kootenay Lake ferry service.
You know, I may have forgot about it, but you know, you mentioned and delve into quite a bit of the detail and history of the early sternwheelers, and they actually played an active role in the ferry system, right?
Yes, the later ones. Yes, they did. Yeah, the ferries, the paddle wheelers, the CPR paddle wheelers were taken off the lake in 1930, with the exception of the Moyer. So up until that point in time, they were still in service, and they were able to be used by the ministry to transport vehicles.
Okay, so when did the diesel ferry get introduced?
The diesel ferry was introduced after the Second World War. It was launched, it was the Anscombe, and it was launched in 1947.
So how significant is the fact that we've got this ferry system in the middle of the Canadian Rockies? And you know, not only is it something unique, but it provides a whole lot of economic benefit and employment. Can you just talk a little bit about the impact of that system?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of employment, I mean, a lot of people from around the Proctor, the outlet area, Queens Bay, they all found employment with the ministry in terms of the ferry. A lot of the students worked there on the summer as deckhands, and over the years it is and continues to be a major employer around that area.
Right.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the Kootenay Lake Ferry system, can you tell me some of your favorite stories, or maybe what's unique about the system?
Okay, well, let's try a story.
Okay.
One of the ones that I always found interesting is in 1959, prior to 1959, there was no radar on the boats. Okay. It was navigated by compass and time. Mm-hmm. And the compass was a magnetic compass. And then in 1959, and it was a winter storm, and they had just left Kootenay Bay, but on the ferry was two large trucks that were doing some infrastructure work in Nelson, and they had 40-foot lengths of pipe, metal pipe. Mm-hmm. And anyway, they started across the lake. It was a terrible night, snowy, dark, cold. And when they got to where they thought they would approach the outlet, they weren't there. They couldn't see the range lights. They couldn't see the mid-channel dolphin. So with their experience, the captain put the boat in, stopped the boat, and they turned the searchlight on to see where they were. And they couldn't believe it. 100 yards ahead of them was a steep cliff, rocky cliff. They could see the CPR rails above the cliff. And had they not stopped at that particular time, they would have crashed into that cliff. And what they realized was the problem was that because it was a magnetic compass, all that metal was distracting on the car deck. And it put them about 15 or 20 degrees off course.
Amazing. And
next morning, they were phoning the ministry for radar. Yeah.
So that's when the radar was instituted on the boats.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I think most of us are familiar with Kootenay Lake, and I think we think of it as a placid, great place to vacation and so forth, but it can really kick up a storm on the lake, is that not right?
Absolutely. It is a very volatile lake. Large waves, the prominent wind direction is from the south. Mm-hmm. South and north are the two main, and it has the whole south arm to build up momentum. So those rollers are pretty big by the time they get in the ferry's path.
So does it require a particular skill for the crew, the captain and the crew?
Absolutely. They have to, I mean, again, we're talking 100 years. So when you're talking the days of the sternwheeler, for instance, when the Nisukan would come up from Kootenay Landing, it had to make that turn, a sharp turn, to get into the outlet. If there was a bad southern wind blowing, she would go into Queens Bay and turn there and then come back and approach the outlet from the front, right? Because if she attempted to make that turn, she would roll violently over. So they had to be aware. They had to be aware of winds. They had to be aware of currents, and that prior to the lake being dammed up through the Columbia River Treaty, that the Kootenay Lake rises and falls, used to rise and fall 20 feet.
Right.
And that made quite a difference in terms of high water, in terms of currents, in terms of driftwood. We don't see that today.
Right.
Not since 1967. That isn't the case anymore.
So your captain and crew have to know what they're doing and know how to navigate that.
They absolutely, they have to know what they're very experienced in the currents and wind conditions, and yes.
Just going back to the sternwheeler days, I just picture in my mind that famous picture of the Greyhound bus perched on the foredeck.
Yeah.
And just maybe describe what was going on in that particular instance.
Well, you couldn't, the Nisukan, you had to load from the side. So there was a gangway door, it was 8 feet tall. So all the automobiles were loaded into the freight deck, but anything that was taller than 8 feet had to be carried on the bow. So they had to take off the forepeak that was on there. They had to take a lot of the bulwarks away so that it could clear a space for those trucks and buses to go on the front of it. And basically that was commercial traffic, so that was loaded first. Usually they would back on. Because they had to have a ramp to get up, like at Fraser's Landing, there was a steep ramp to get up, and it would be difficult for the deckhand to motion the driver back. So they preferred to back on, so it was better that way. But the problem is that the Nisukan's bow was only about 40 feet wide where those vehicles were going on. So sometimes if the overhang of the wheels, the carriage overhung the wheels a lot, they would have to move the vehicle back, the truck back over to the far side until they got out into the water, and then they could put it back into the midsection, because if there was any overhang on the starboard side, they could hit a piling or something like that coming in. So whatever they did on one side, they had to repeat on the other side.
I see. So they had to really make sure it was all balanced out.
It was balanced properly, and it was tied down. There was tie downs on there to winch it down tight. And I think a lot of people from the 30s and 40s, that especially people from the prairies, they looked at that was the strangest thing, that this thing, it just looked like it was going to tumble over into the water.
Fascinating, because you can even look at photos today and you wonder, how did that ever stay on there? But a little bit of a side note, the Greyhound bus, it had some roots in the Nelson area.
Yes.
And so it was part of that essential transportation link as well.
Well, it was interesting is when the provincial government got involved in the ferry business in 1930. That's when they decided to lease the Nisukan, when it was a big structure in all its decks. And when the Greyhound service started with that, they couldn't put the bus on the ferry, so they had a passenger car that handled 8 passengers, and that they drove to Creston or to Ferny, and then they got on the coach at Ferny and then made the rest of the trip like if it was going to Calgary.
Interesting. I never knew that.
And another point that's of interest on that is the fact that a lot of merchants that had trucks where their cabs behind the cab, the box behind the cab was taller than 8 feet. They couldn't go on the ferry. But what they did do is they devised crank systems so that they could lower the box down and then lower the roof down so that they could get onto the ferry, and then at the other side they would raise it back up again.
So customize their trucks so they could get on the ferry.
Very ingenious. Yeah.
Michael, I just wanted to ask you, there's a huge, strong connection between the early days of the railway, CPR, and the ferry system. How did those two link together? Well,
with the CPR running the passenger boat down to Kootenay Landing every day, and that's where it would connect with the Crow's Nest Pass railway train. It would connect it would drop passengers off heading east about 10 o'clock in the morning. The boat would stay at Kootenay Landing for the day, and then the westbound train came in about 4 o'clock. The passengers would load, and then they would return to Nelson. So that was the daily run. That was done 7 days a week. So the idea of putting the cars onto the ferry, they couldn't do that at Kootenay Landing because Kootenay Landing was just a rail connection. There was no road access out there.
Right.
So they needed a spot close on the east shore to do that, and that was Kuskonook, and so that became the connection.
When we talk about the Kootenay Lake ferry system, and it's sort of a broad subject, but the thing I really liked about your book is that you focused in on certain aspects of that history and how colorful it was. What are some of the modern day stories and some of the modern day history that sort of fascinated you?
Well, that's an interesting question because just start to answer it with this. A lot of the older people that I interviewed, the veteran senior captains, and they would have been from the era of the Anscombe 1947 after the war, they always referred to that as a service. It was the Kootenay Lake Ferry Service. Nowadays, since 2001, it's been modernized and it's operated privately. And the people that I've talked to in that era, 2004 forward, they don't refer to it as a service anymore. They refer to it as a job.
Okay.
So I found that to be very interesting. And I tried my best to work that idea of service into the title.
Right.
Because I really felt that was important. That's it.
Right.
They didn't talk about I did this and I did that. It was we did that and we did this.
Right. Well, it's one of the major visitor or tourist attractions in the region, and it's often promoted as the world's longest free ferry. Was that always the case?
No, it was not. People have to recognize that in 1963, the ministry completed the Kootenay Pass, what they called the Skyway from Creston to Salmo. Up until that point, the Kootenay Lake ferries there was tolls on the ferries. Okay, so when they completed the Skyway, they did away with the tolls on the ferries, and they also did away with the tolls on the Nelson Bridge.
Okay.
And that was because it now represented an alternative route. There was an alternative way to get from east to west Kootenays, and that was to go over top of the Skyway.
Right.
If you wanted to take the ferry, it was still available to you. And it remains a vital thing, even to this day, because if you have any disruptions on the Kootenay Pass, those ferries are running 7 days a week.
Yeah.
And so they can help that for snow avalanches, fires, accidents.
Right.
We see that. And also today, it still remains vital because people, like if you're going to Nelson for medical or services like that, or doing business in Nelson, that represents about 70% of the traffic that runs on that ferry. So it's still a vital, not maybe as vital as it was at one point, but it certainly maintained its vitality.
Well, as your book indicates, it certainly connects the Kootenays, east and west Kootenays. I wanted to talk a little bit about specifically the book, and I admire the work that you've put into the book. So well designed, well laid out. The thing that struck me as I went through it is just a tremendous collection of photographs. Where'd you get all the photos?
Well, I've been doing this a long time. I sat down one day and tried to put a number to it, and it's somewhere over 50 years. So I won't try to date myself any more than that. But I got them from people that I talked to.
Right.
I had a lot of conversations, a lot of stories that I tried to capture, and those were over the years. More recently, you pick them up at card meets and stuff like that, and eBay even. So it's been a passion for those years. So it's been a lot of collecting.
About the photographs, I understand that there's some maybe never before seen photos from your collection. Were you happy to put those in?
Absolutely. I think the readers are going to find that that's one very interesting aspect of this book, is that there are these photographs most of them have never been seen before. And I owe a great deal to my father-in-law, who digitized all those photographs, and he spent the time to do nice, sharp enhancements and stuff. So those photographs are really top-notch stuff. So
yeah, they
very
really,
fortunate that way.
Really tell the story for sure, and a highlight of the book. Just let's talk about the production of the book. I know this is a 350-page book. We're talking about a pretty substantial project here. How long did it take you to put it all together? I suspect that this was a project you've been working on for some time.
Well, it's difficult to say in terms of actual time, because a lot of the interviews that I did in early years, all that material was incorporated into this book. So there's a lot going forward, but I would say probably 5 years of fairly focused attention to putting this book. He was also running a business and raising a family, so it wasn't entirely that, but about 5 years of pretty intensive work.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, your results have your hard work has paid off with good results. It looks really nice.
Thank you.
It reads well, and the design of it is excellent as well. So when you start out on a project like this, did you have a concept or a vision as to what you wanted to see?
I did. I pretty well I knew what the story was, and I just had to put it down on paper, and a lot of back and forth with editors and proofreaders and stuff. I mean, one of the things that I found, I mean, I'm new to this.
Right.
This is my first book. But one of the things I found in the Kootenays is there is a tremendous amount of professional talent out there. I was really amazed at the quality of individuals for proofreading and copy editing and design work. Just amazing number of people that anyone that's looking at writing a book, they would have no problem finding professional help in the Kootenays.
Yeah, lots of resources out there.
Yeah.
So what do you think, Michael, why do you think this is such an important story to record and talk about and tell future generations about?
Well, there's several reasons for it. I guess mainly it's the fact that I wanted to get the story out. It's taken me longer than most people to realize that when these people pass away, the stories go with them. And that to me was important. It was important for me to capture their stories because, like I say, when they're gone, they're gone. And I think in today's environment, younger historians have tremendous abilities to do digitized newspapers, and they have a lot of resources at their hand that I didn't have. I mean, in my day, it was the old microfilm reader and going to the library and photocopying stuff. Today, that's all different. But what the younger historians don't have are the stories, the actual stories from the people that were there.
Right.
And I really wanted to capture that. I wanted to tell their story in a professional manner that they would be happy with.
So how cooperative were people when you went out and said you wanted to interview them about their job or about the ferry? How did that all go?
Well, interestingly, a lot of the older people, the veterans, even going back to the steam side of it, they were very willing to talk. Okay, very, very interested in what I was doing, and I created some lifelong relationships with some amazing people. I've been very, very fortunate to have had those conversations, not strictly on the boats and stuff, but on life in general. They great influence. I can't say enough about that. But the younger people I found were more difficult to talk to. Like they didn't want to talk too much. If you're still working on the ferries, that might not be a good idea. But the retired people, you could sit them down and they could talk, for hours.
So they're willing to tell you the stories, and
Yeah.
and thank you, Michael, for recording those stories. I just wanted to talk about the economic impact and of the ferry system. And in fact, at one point in time, there was a pretty vibrant shipbuilding industry in and around the Kootenay Lake area.
Yes, the CPR had a very complex structure at Nelson, the shipyard there, the ways, and the Great Northern had ways at Mirror Lake near Caslow. So there was a lot of shipbuilding. And it's interesting to see how the shipbuilding has changed, like the technology.
Can you give us an example?
Well, for instance, the Nisukan, which was built in 1913, her hull was riveted. It was riveted steel and riveted construction. So that meant that the hull was built down east. They would put it all together, and then they would take it apart and they would bring it out in pieces, and then they would re-rivet it together at Nelson.
Oh, okay.
And that, for instance, the same thing was true with the Anscombe in 1946 when they were building that. It was built in Vancouver.
Yeah.
They would build all the structure and then take it apart and then bring it out here and reassemble it. In 1954, just afterwards, when it came time for the Balfour to be built, it was welded. It wasn't riveted, it was welded. And so that type of construction allowed them to build the boat in pieces and bring them out in pieces and then assemble them in pieces. So it represented a tremendous savings in labor costs.
Right.
And then if you look at the Osprey, it was built in 2000, it was built much the same way, except they used plasma cutters and CAD engineering and all the rest of it. But it was built on the same basis. They would build these modules and then they would reassemble them, and then they would just put them together when they got to Nelson. So
Right.
it was more of just an assembly thing than
Right.
anything else. So,
Right.
so a very different technique involved over that 100-year period.
So what's the future hold for the ferry system? I understand they are in the process of either designing or building a new ferry, is that correct?
The building is started already at Nelson.
Okay.
It's going to be launched in 2023. It's a 55-car ferry, so it's almost double the capacity of the Balfour.
Right.
It's supposed to be an electric-ready ferry,
Okay.
so but it's not necessarily going to be fully functional as an electric-ready ferry until they've got the terminal facilities put up. But that's part of the BC government's plan to electrify the entire inland fleet by 2040.
Okay.
So that's one challenge they've got. The other challenge that's coming up is the Osprey has to be taken out of the water by 2025 to have its hull inspected, its midlife hull inspection.
Okay.
They're looking for locations. I don't know how far they've got in that, but that's going to be a major job hauling that one out of the water.
Yeah.
And they're currently, right now, they're doing service improvements on the wharfs, the terminals at both Kootenay Bay and Balfour. They're putting better lighting in, a lot safety measures for passengers, for foot passengers, bus terminals, stations for electric cars. So those are some new challenges that are going on there. And then down the road, I've always kind of started thinking about these autonomous cars. How is that going to impact the ferries,
Yeah.
right? And actually, I've heard that I understand that there's an autonomous ferry now
Oh, really?
in Europe, so
Yeah.
there's no crew driving it.
So who knows where that'll take us, right?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, I just wanted to refer to a bit of a side note. You know, I spent some time camping over at Kootenay Creek Provincial Park, and I was out exploring one day, and I came across this family that lives just outside of Nelson, and they had this private museum. You know, the family, the Learmouths.
Yes.
And can you just tell us a little bit about some of the amazing things that they have in that museum?
Well, yeah, Bert Learmouth, his dad was connected with the Greyhound. He was the one who sort of founded Greyhound, and so there was that connection there. And Bert was very familiar with the boats on the lake, and after he retired, he went into making all these models, and it's an incredible story. I mean, he cut willow trees down on his property and shaved the wood, and a very imaginative man. How he as a model maker, how you produce these beautiful lifeboats and paddle covers, and with the Nasukan model, you can actually lift it up and you can see inside the dining room and all of that. So amazing,
Yeah.
just simply amazing, and some of the best model work that I've ever seen.
Yeah, and what a tribute to the stern-wheeler era and also the ferry system. He sort of captured the essence of those ships. Michael, your book's been out for a couple of months now. What has been the reaction?
Well, I don't have anything to really gauge it to, but I've been happy with what's sold. I mean, there was 500 printed, and I think we're more than half that have sold already. So we're looking probably at a second reprinting coming up. It's a little early in the season, I think. I think when the tourists start coming, I think there'll be more interest. I haven't been able to place it like at the Interpretation Center at the Moyer and stuff like that,
Yeah.
which I think would be good sources.
Yeah.
But I'm happy with it now. I just, as I say, I don't have anything to compare it to. But
And I understand you've reached out to a number of community groups, or they've reached out to you, and it seems like you're a willing guest to come in and talk about the Kootenay Lake ferry system.
I've enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I really enjoy it. I'm not a very good speaker, as you can tell, but I enjoy going in and letting people know.
Have you heard any stories that you said, "Oh, I wish I would have included those"?
A few people have come forward. It's very interesting that how people, they look at the book and they see detail in there that I never saw. And I'm just amazed at that. They pick out very small, minute items that you'd think, how would anybody ever recognize that?
Right.
So that's interesting.
Right.
And I've gotten a lot of emails from people whose mother was on the ferries and stuff, like worked on the ferries, and they just enjoyed it. It just,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, and that's, again, part of the legacy that you talk about is the people that have been employed, and you know, that was their life.
Yes.
It generated the income for their whole family. So
Yes. Yes, it did.
It's a tremendous thing. Well, thank you, Michael. We really appreciate you being a guest today
Okay.
on Talking
Thank
Kootenai
you.
Books. Thank you for putting the effort forth to put out this book, Connecting the Kootenays. 100 years of service, and continue the good work, and we look forward to your continuing feedback on your book.
Thank you very much.
This is Talking Kootenai Books. My name is Keith Powell.